In this set of videos, we're looking at what was happening during the war years, 1939 to 1945. And when you think of the impact of the Nazis during these war years, we need to look at two separate things. The impact on the German people, and then the impact on the people who lived in the occupied countries. In this set of videos, we're focusing on Germany exclusively. And in the last video, we looked at the impact of war in the early war years. In this video, I'd like to look at the impact of war on opposition to the Nazis, and in the next video, we'll look at what the impact of war was in the latter war years. In this video, I'd like to look at the impact of the war on opposition to the Nazis. If you remember back, in a video probably we looked at, I'd imagine about 10 videos back now. In that video we were looking at opposition to the Nazis before the war, and I said that this was a sliding scale. The opposition could actually take many different forms and could be very, very different. You have opposition that really starts from passive opposition, where you could be doing something as simple as refusing to see Kyle whilst in a crowd, all the way up to an active opposition, where you're using violence to oppose the Nazis. In the war years, opposition was on that exact same sliding scale, from passive to active, and we're going to look at lots of different types of opposition today, some of which are much more passive and some of which are a hell of a lot more active. Now, opposition to the Nazis in the war years did change, and in particular, as the Nazis start doing badly in the war, and this is a photo of Stalingrad, which really was the turning point in the war when the Nazis start losing the war. And when the Nazis start losing the war, funnily enough, more people opposed the Nazis. It's really important though that we realise that this opposition was still on a very, very small scale. I'd like to go through some examples of what opposition the Nazis did face in the war. And let's start with probably my favourite example of opposition, Otto Anneliese Hampel. And this is them on the right hand side. Now, in 1940, at the start of the war, Elise's brother was killed in action, and these two working class people from Berlin were suddenly spurred into resistance. Angry at what had happened to Elise's brother, they wrote and distributed over 200 anti-Nazi postcards. Here's an example of one. Now, on these postcards, Otto Anneliese would scrawl anti-Nazi phrases and sayings. In this picture you can see that they scrubbed out the face of Hitler on the stamp, and amongst this, I don't read all of the German, amongst it says murderers. Now, these postcards were then left in prominent places in Berlin. Often Otto and Elise would walk into a huge block of flats and they would leave these postcards in prominent places like the stairs, where the residents would see the postcards and see these anti-Nazi phrases. Interestingly though, most of the postcards were delivered immediately back to the Gestapo because people who saw them were so frightened by what they'd seen. And over time, the Gestapo worked out how to track these two down. It took them 2 years to do it, and in 1943, very sadly, the Hampels were tried and executed in the People's Courts. Another example of opposition the Nazis faced, slightly more active than the passiveness of just sending postcards and leaving them in prominent places, was by this group of young people, the White Rose Group. The White Rose Group were led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, who you can see in this picture here. And it was a group of students who wrote anti-Nazi leaflets in Munich University. They wrote 5 series of leaflets, and the 5th in January of 1943, which is probably the most prominent of the leaflets they wrote, stated that Hitler could not win the war. They distributed between 6,000 and 9,000 copies of that leaflet across Germany, really showing the impact that opposition could have. When they tried to publish the 6th of their series of leaflets, though, just after losing the Battle of Stalingrad, the Scholls were caught red-handed as they were lobbing the leaflets over a balcony in Munich University. The Gestapo arrested them again and they were executed. Criticism from the church also continued in this period. And Cardinal Galen, who we saw was one of those figures who were criticising the Nazis pre-war, continued his criticisms. He continued to preach against Nazi ideas, and in 1941 he preached against Gestapo terror and murder. Where before the war he was ignored and left alone, during the war suddenly that criticism was too much for the Nazis, and he was held under house arrest until 1945 and the end of the Second World War. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we also saw in that pre-war years, who was a prominent Protestant priest who argued against Nazi ideas, continued his resistance and actually stepped it up a gear. He joined the military intelligence, the Abwehr, and using his position in the military intelligence, he secretly passed messages to the resistance and underground movements in Germany. He helped to organise the escape of Jews, but eventually he was also caught by the Gestapo. He was placed in a concentration camp outside Berlin, and then eventually moved to Dachau concentration camp, where he was killed in April of 1945, 2 weeks before the end of the war. The most significant opposition the Nazis faced during the war, though, was really from their own men and their own army officers. This man here is called Klaus von Stauffenberg, and he was an very, very high-ranking army officer. And Stauffenberg and other army officers plotted to kill Hitler. They didn't like what they saw was happening in the war, and Stauffenberg in particular didn't like what was happening with the murder of Jews. And he had decided he was going to try and kill Hitler. Their plan, which was known as Operation Valkyrie, was that Stauffenberg would bring a bag of explosives to a meeting that he would have with Hitler in East Prussia. So Stauffenberg was such a prominent army officer that he was given access to Hitler himself. And his plan was that he would meet Hitler at a place called the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia on the eastern front, where Stauffenberg would set a bag of explosives off to detonate 10 minutes after Stauffenberg had left the meeting. This plan went into action on the 20th of July, and Stauffenberg detonated his suitcase of explosives which he'd left under a table in that meeting at the Wolf's Lair, and Stauffenberg made an excuse, left the meeting, and fled back to Berlin, where he thought he had killed Hitler. The bomb completely failed, and we'll show a photo of that in a minute. And as a result of that bomb failing, Stauffenberg and all his conspirators were arrested and they were executed. This to me shows how opposition during the war does change though. Suddenly, if the army are now involved as well, it shows the seriousness of opposition. And this picture here shows how devastating that bomb was. This is Hitler's trousers, which got blown apart during that bomb. So the bomb did go off, but unfortunately for Stauffenberg, the bomb was next to a massive table leg, and the table leg took the impact of the bomb rather than Hitler himself. So Hitler did escape from this. Now there's some big questions about opposition during the war that I think we should think about. How widespread was opposition? Not very, but it's very difficult to know how widespread passive opposition was. We think that passive opposition possibly was growing during the war, so people saying Hitler jokes or refusing to participate in some of those Nazi ideas, but it's very difficult to say that how widespread was active opposition. Of the examples we've seen, minimal, still very small. How significant a threat was opposition? I think it was more of a significant threat during World War II than it was pre-war, because you can see that in this period of time there are more examples of where there is active opposition, and things like the July bomb plot to me are examples of how this was very significant. However, there wasn't a lot of opposition. So if we're looking at why wasn't there more, I think most people lived in complete and abject fear of the Nazis. You've seen in the examples we've just looked at in the last 10 minutes how most of those people were arrested reasonably quickly by the Gestapo and executed. And this to me shows why there wasn't more opposition. Opposition wasn't more prominent because people were scared about the consequences of what would happen next.